Good morning. If, again, you're visiting and you don't have an outline, there's outlines on the two communion tables, and that will really help you today. We're going to cover quite a few things in terms of introducing things. Give me a half second. The book of Romans historically has been kind of the turning point for many people's lives historically. You go all the way back to the 3rd century, and Augustine has been raised with a Christian mother especially, but he's virtually a practicing pagan, and then he starts reading the book of Romans and kind of changes his whole life. Martin Luther is a monk. He has gone from Germany to Rome. He's walked up steps on his knees. He's done penance. He's done everything else. And his life is still restless and a little bit strange for us, but he's in confession one day, and the priest on the other side says, "Have you ever read the book of Romans?" Well, a lot of these people were students of both Greek and Latin, so Martin Luther starts reading the book of Romans in Greek and just totally changes his whole perspective. And the reason I want to start with that is that when I hear the word Protestant, I always hear the word protest. So when you hear the word Protestant, then I always think of the word protest, and Martin Luther is protesting against all of the abuses in the Roman Church, and he came up with his point of view that said it's faith only, grace only, and Scripture only. And so we are surrounded by people today who are children of the protest. And we will hear people say, well, I was saved by faith, but you're saved by works when you're baptized. And because we're surrounded with that, that's a part of what we're going to look at and deal with today. And surprisingly, as we look at the book of Romans, and if you have talked with our religious neighbors, especially if they say, accept Jesus in your heart or say the sinner's prayer, those of you who know my younger brother, he's just a scream, and we have driven cross country several times at night and would listen to programs. And this guy was saying, "Brethren, if you're lost, place your hand on the radio and you'll be saved." And riding with my brother late at night and listening to some guy talk about laying your hand on the radio to be saved, we laughed and laughed because it's so foreign to that. I want to read a quote to you, and like I said, most of this will be introducing things today. I was in Harding and Memphis 2 separate times, and the first time, very appropriately, our New Testament teacher specialized on we should preach Christ and Him crucified, and that's true. And he just mentioned sometimes in the Church of Christ, we should major on that. Years later, I went back, and the next New Testament teacher said, Christ is very important, but the whole Bible is God-centered. And someone just mentioned something about Philippians 2, even though he was in the form of God, he didn't consider equality to God something to be grasped, but he emptied himself, he made himself nothing, kept on going. And the teacher said, and keep reading. And then you come to this, to give glory to God. And like, for example, in John chapter 1, Jesus came to explain the Father. And my favorite quotation about Paul, this is from Leon Morris. He lived in Melbourne a lot of times for many years. Again, we wouldn't use the term, but it's very appropriate. Paul was a God-intoxicated man. And just let that sink in. Paul was a God-intoxicated man. There's an underground loop of trains in Sydney, and I was on the train one day, and bless his heart, there was a guy who had too much to drink, and he was trying to get off the train. But in his mind, because he was intoxicated, that little gap looked like a broad jump pit to him. and the door would open, and he'd get his nerve up, and I thought, I'm just going to wait and see how long it takes this guy to get off the train. I don't know how long he'd been doing this, but I was with him for 5 additional stops. And, the bell would ring, and you'd hope there'd be nobody on the other side, and he'd get his nerve up, and he would just get ready, and he'd run right to the edge, and then he'd go. On the 5th one, he started on the wall, and he broad jumped off of this gap about this wide. And when he landed, he went, and he was so proud of himself because he had safely gotten off of the train. Well, when someone is intoxicated, it impacts the way they see things, the way they function, the way they live. And isn't this an interesting expression? Paul was a God-intoxicated man. He spoke constantly about the one who was central in his thinking. Everything he dealt with related to God. And listen to this. I wouldn't have been aware of this without him pointing this out. Paul refers to God far more often than anyone else in the New Testament. He has 40% of all the New Testament references to God. So stop just a second, just stop and think. What percentage are his 13 letters? The Gospels are half. You got Hebrews and all these others. And in these 13 letters, Paul gives us 40% of the references to God in the whole New Testament. And just kind of process that. And then here was the next comment. He said, in the book of Romans, which is why I'm reading this, in the book of Romans, he uses the word God 153 times. Can I say that again? Just let that soak in. A little book of 16 chapters. In 16 chapters, Paul uses the word God 153 times, and it's an average of once every 46 words. And other than prepositions and some other small words, this is the most frequently used word in the book of Romans. So a good part of what we're going to do today, as we introduce Romans, also has to do with reading our New Testament letters. And obviously you can tell I've given you more than we can cover in a class period. Lord willing, we're going to be doing our Monday night at North Mac later in the spring. And we're just going to feature this in terms of looking and approaching New Testament letters. A part of the background of this is that while we were in Sydney, I was able to go to Macquarie University, and they specialized in having papyri. The book has been sent to the printer. They have tried to locate every letter from Revelation until the legalization of Christianity in Egypt. And in Egypt, the Nile is both like an interstate, and let's do north and south this way, and it doesn't rain typically. And so in the late 1800s, they found that the local town, you want to call it dump, tumble, tip, and you stop and think, if it doesn't rain, then things don't decay. So you put them in that warm, arid sand, and unless sandworms get into them, then the papyri look like they did when they were put in there 2,000 years ago. So my project while I was there was looking at 1st and 2nd century papyri letters. And I probably looked at more than 2,000 letters from the 1st and 2nd century. Never gets old to see something that says 36 AD, 25 AD. And these people aren't Christians because Christianity hasn't come yet. But they developed a style of writing, and Abraham Malherbe has located 2 writer's manuals for how to write letters. I wouldn't do this with our grandchildren. They'd look like us like we've lost our mind. In typing or business class, did any of you have, here's the different forms of letters that you use for different types of occasions? You know what I'm talking about? Here's like a business letter, and here's the format, and then these different types of letters. Well, this is the same thing developed, and what we're going to look at today is that it became structured enough so that even people who were illiterate, which was the majority, people who were illiterate wrote letters to each other. And you stop and think, how do people who are illiterate write letters? Well, there's a scribe either under a tree or at the corner, and if John's not here today, so we can pick on him and he won't notice. If John and I are business partners and I need to write to him, then I go to my local scribe and I describe our relationship. We're partners, we're running the business, this is what I need him to do. And then I slowly dictate the letter and the scribe will write it down. And then we find someone going that direction because there's not a postal system. And on the back of some of these letters, you know, you go to the blue house close to downtown and go to this tree and turn right and go down this street. If you don't have a postal system, and that's why all of these associates around Paul are so critical in the New Testament, they are the couriers to get these letters out, especially while he's imprisoned. And so here my friend John gets a letter and he can't read it, so what does he do? Well, he goes to the local scribe who's on the corner under the tree, and he reads the letter back to him. And so there's an amazing amount of correspondence in the first 2 or 3 centuries between people who are illiterate. And I still find that amazing, just the creativity. Even if I can't read and write, I still need to communicate, and then this is the way that they did it. And so because of that, then very specific conventions were established to enable people to be able to read and write. Where I want us to start today is that if you look at the pink in the middle, and if you're at home, I want you to write a few things down. And the first thing I want you to write down, if you're at home, is the word disclosure formula. And if you look at the top on number 1, in all of Paul's letters, he will start and, well, let me say it this way. All the things that are in the blue that are the opening are the summary of all the different things that Paul does in all of his letters. None of these will be in every letter. And again, your grandchildren will look at me and wonder what we're talking about. First cafeteria, the idea is not to get a spoonful of every salad, a bite of every piece of meat, a spoonful. You choose different things for your tray, and you go through and, okay, we're going to do this for salads. We're going to do this for, the meats. We're going to do this for the vegetables, this for desserts. And so what we're going to see is that in every letter, these are the things that are there, and Paul's going to pull down the ones that are appropriate for that particular thing. And so in this first group, in the opening, you're going to say, hello, we're glad you're here. There's often going to be a thanksgiving and a prayer, which will often be the key point of the letter. But at a certain point in time, here will come the expression. He will either say, I want you to know. I do not want you to be ignorant. I do not want you to be unaware, or as for you. And so what you can anticipate when you read a letter is that in the opening part, there's going to be a series of these types of things, but he is also going to introduce the main point of the letter in that opening part. So those who have a copy, if you'll turn over the back page just behind the colored page, and this will take just a little bit, but I want you to read down this opening part of Romans 1, and someone tell me where you come across either I want you to know, I do not want you to be ignorant, or I do not want you to be unaware. Just read down, and when someone finds it, holler out, and then we'll look at it. 13. I borrowed a New Testament from a girlfriend in 1972 and never did give it back to her, which has been to Australia 46 times so far. And so in the Bible that I carry with me, every time I come to, I want you to know, I don't want you to be ignorant, I literally draw a line in my text. And what that tells me is that all of these things on the blue side are going to be above that, because the disclosure formula is the point where Paul, hello, how are you doing? What's going on? Greetings. I'm thankful for, I pray that, which becomes very, very important. And in the process of that, all of those things will be in the opening. And then as soon as he says, I do not want you to be unaware, I want you to know, as for you, he has moved into the main body of the letter. Okay? So what I want you to notice next is that if you just turn back to the side, and we're going to come right back to the same page. In the same way, at some point there's going to be a closing. I'm sorry. In conclusion, travel plans. While we're in Australia, our daughter's about 8, and she says, I know how to do lessons. You go for a while, and then you say, finally, and then you just keep right on talking. And then you go for a while, and then you say, in conclusion, and then you just keep right on talking. I've been listening to my dad, and I'm thinking, oh, dear. We're all relieved sometimes when the speaker finally says, finally. But don't get relieved when Paul says, finally. But typically, at some point, he's going to come to the end of the letter. And so, every time I study a New Testament letter, I read down on the opening until I want you to know and to be aware. And then I literally go to the back and start with the closing and photocopy those and put them on the same page. And I may read those for 2 weeks. Because oftentimes what Paul introduces in, I want you to know, I want you to be aware, then he will come back and conclude with. So, turn the color page over again. And this will be just on the top. And if you'll notice, and it'll be easier to start with, but just look at it for a second. Look at the closing from 16:25 through 27. And then read the opening in chapter 1, 1 through 6. And just kind of look at the two and compare. And again, if you're at home, then look at Romans 16, 25 through 27, this closing paragraph. Look at the opening 7 verses in the first chapter, and look into and say, oh, are there any things that connect or any things that are the same in the hello, I'm glad you're here, and finally. What do you find? The obedience of faith. And where do we find that? If you look in 1:5, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name among the nations. First chapter. And that's why we wanted you to have the handout. Again, if you're visiting, the handouts are on each of the tables. And then when you read in chapter 16, the command to the eternal God to bring about the obedience that comes by faith. What are our Protestant friends telling us when they talk to us? Oh, I'm saved by faith and you're saved by works. And just a quick hint, just so I don't forget this, every time someone is commanded what to do, Acts 2, repent and be baptized. Why do you tarry? Arise and be baptized. Be baptized is passive. And when we talk about this in class earlier, and I'm with my 5-year-olds again, I tie my shoe is active. I reach down and do that. What's the difference? My shoe is being tied. We've all told a small child, please be still so I can tie your shoe. But what's the difference? In the active, I reach down and do this, and in passive, someone does it to me. Is this active or passive? I accepted Jesus in my heart. Active. I said the sinner's prayer. I went in front to the altar call. Do you see the irony? The people who charge us with being saved by works, what they do to be saved is active, and when we're told to repent and be baptized, nobody in the first century would let them get away with that because, I'm sorry for the bad grammar, be baptized is not active. It's something that is done to us and through us, and the book, number one book outside of John, that the children of the protest go to is the book of Romans, and we've all heard this what? With the mouth, confession is made, with the heart and all this stuff, and you need to accept Jesus in your heart. But how does Paul open and close the book of Romans? He's going to talk about the obedience that comes from faith. And here's what's interesting. When you think, and I told you this a couple of weeks ago, our son is named Luther Kent, grandfather, wonderful elder, brother Kent. You drop the LU and the KE and you get Luke. But something we've talked about through the years is that Luke, we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Martin Luther. His attempt to reform the church was a very significant thing, and going back to Scripture. However, we don't propose grace only, faith only. There's 20 things that are said that save us in the New Testament. We say, use all of them. And here's Earl West, church historian. In running past Rome, Martin Luther ran past Jerusalem. And the protest so overreacted to all the salvation by works things in the Roman church that today we're surrounded with people who are in the protest, and then they look at us as if we're the ones who are at fault because we say you must repent and be baptized, which is passive for the forgiveness of sins. We're going to do one other thing quickly, and then we'll see how far we can get into the opening. When you look at the bottom of this page, the colored page, in each of the letters, except Colossians, there is a petition. There's a term that says, this is what I want you to do. And we'll come to this later, but I just want to touch on this, and then we'll go back. The first form is the word axios, and this is just to whom it may concern. And if you're saying, I want you to do something, and it's a government official, use that. But the second petition on the bottom, the formal petition, if there's a sense of distance, you're writing to the governor, someone important, then deomai is, and I always, when I read deomai, I always put my arm out this way. In the papyri letters, I found 3 women writing about divorce proceedings to their husband. And I need him to do something. And so if you're involved in divorce proceedings, this is what you do. Guess where this are used? The book of Galatians. There's no thanksgiving. There's no I'm thankful for. Oh, I'm amazed you're so soon removed from the faith to another faith, which is not the gospel. And Galatians is the only letter where the church is not called saints. Every other church, Paul uses the word saint except Galatians. And so when he asked them to do something in 4:12, then he uses this petition term for distance. The second one is familiar. This is family, friends, people who are close. And so, again, if John and I are in a business working agreement and I need him to do something, when it's time to say, I ask you, I want you to do this, then we're going to use erotao, which is this word for being familiar and warm and close. And guess where this is used? Philippians and Thessalonians. What's the difference in Galatians and Philippians? And when you find the term of petition, then it defines the nature of the relationship between the reader and the writer. The bottom one, and Lord willing, we'll come to this later, this is the parakaleo, and this is it's important. John, I need you to buy, sell, I need you to invest, I need you to make a deposit. And when you want something done through relationship, you call someone close to them. And we'll do this when we come to chapter 12. But this is Paul's signature of ministry. This is how he goes about getting things done. And as you read the letters, notice how seldom he will command something, but how often he will pull someone close to him. Our football, we were at Midwest City. We were at the East Side for 41 years in all, counting our 12 years in Australia, but our kids went to Carl Albert. We had a great coaching and football staff. These guys, most of them were Christians, and great, great guys. And the first meeting with parents is, we're paid to be coaches, but we're here to develop character in young men. And if we develop character, we're going to win our share of games. And they've won 10 or 11 out of 20 state championships. Wonderful program. But the other team's marching down the field. They call timeout. Like I said, 0 profanity. But you'll see Mike Goff go over and put his arms around the linebackers and say, now, guys, we need to draw the line right here. This is where we need to put an end to this, right? And over and again, you would see a coach reach out and pull someone. Para is the word for close. kaleo is the word for call. Every time you, and the list is here, and here's our Romans ones, and that's the only time we have time to do. We're going to have this whole discussion about Jews and Gentiles, and we'll see why in just a second. But this is the behavioral objective. This is what I want you to do. And so when I'm writing to John, and again, talking to the secretary here, and then he reads it, I say, I urge you to, then this is the behavioral objective for the letter. And you don't have to wish or wonder or doubt. And see, to Philemon, I could order you what to do, but I choose to appeal to you, and here's parakaleo. You're very familiar with this. Jews and Gentiles, we're going to work all the way through the first 11 chapters. Lord willing, in chapter 12, I urge you, I beg you, I appeal to you. See that? Present your bodies as living sacrifices. Don't be shaped by this present world's way of thinking. However, metamorphosis, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may approve what is that perfect and acceptable will of God. And so, this is the introduction of what I do every time I come to a New Testament letter. Do the prologue, do the conclusion, is there a common theme? And then look and say, they're in all the letters except Colossians. In each of these letters, at some point, Paul will say, this is what I want you to do. And those of you who are in education know the term behavioral objective. The student will be able to, and our petitions, then, they don't have to wish, they don't have to wonder. They know exactly why Paul wrote the letter, and we'll, Lord willing, come back and talk more about that later. Okay, that was all free, and now we'll start. On the next total page, and we'll just have to highlight some things, the dating of all the New Testament letters, and we've talked about this, are based on two things in Acts. One, Claudius has commanded all the Jews to leave Rome in Acts 18:2. And Claudius was a very interesting figure. Caligula, the one before him, was an absolute nutcase. But Claudius, his head shook a little bit, he drooled a little bit, but he was a fabulous historian and was a wonderful emperor. But at a point in time, the Jews had been causing trouble, and he expelled all the Jews out of Rome in 49. The book of Romans is going to be written about 55. Okay? Don't take offense, okay? But just this morning, you guys are going to be Jews. And so what happens in 49? You're out of here. And see, we're going to see Paul is going to meet Priscilla and Aquila because they have left Rome because they're Jews and they have to leave. Okay. For the rest of us Gentiles, you guys don't hear this, okay? When these picky Jews are gone, how much more enjoyable is it to come to church? We can put bacon in pork and beans. We can have pork chops. We can have ham. We can just enjoy a whole variety of things, and we don't have these picky Jews just looking over our shoulders all the time and saying, no, don't do that. I'm sorry, we started the church on the edge of Sydney, roughly like where Newcastle is. And very, very quickly, we had people from 10 nations. Sorry, I'll do this quick. But Larry Lee brought chicken feet to every church fellowship. Okay. I grew up on the farm. I can eat nearly anything. I don't want him to take all the chicken feet home. So if no one else is taking some, at least I'm going to eat one or two of them and just kind of get ready. You suck the tendons out, and then you get some spaghetti or something that you like and chew it up real quickly and swallow it so you won't imagine where these feet have been and what it actually is. And that's how you get chicken feet down if you didn't. It's an acquired taste, okay? But when you have people from 10 nations bringing potluck, what did Paul say? Ask no questions for conscience sake. And we had 3 kids, and people were just amazed at how disciplined the Hartman kids, they would wait and wait, make sure all of our visitors said, if all the food's gone, we'll stop at McDonald's on the way home. And our kids were they were so patient and so mature and so godly, and they were just hoping that all the food would be gone so we could stop at McDonald's on the way back. But you have a church fellowship with people from 10 nations, and ladies, how would I say this? You don't want to get too much of any one thing that you don't know because you don't want to hurt her feelings as you head to the trash can. It's just just every meal is an experience like that. Well, we've enjoyed all this for 4 or 5 years, and then these guys start coming back. He has the nerve to say, I used to teach the adult Bible class, I should teach the Bible class. And David saying, well, I used to be the treasurer, I took care of the books, I did a good job with that. And so all these Jews are coming back and demanding that we go back to the old days, how things were originally. And this is why the discussion about Jews and Gentiles in the book of Romans is so important. It wasn't their choice. The emperor said, you're gone. And by the time that Paul writes the book of Romans, then this group has come back, and we're having quite a bit of friction with each other because it's a major adjustment. How do I say this without hurting your feelings? With all these picky Jews who tend to look down on us Gentiles and tell us, oh, we're the children of God, and you just came in late. And you just look at this, and when you read the book of Romans, then I see these two groups of people trying to come back together. The obedience of faith is how we got into the church. But as we're going to see, Paul wants the church in Rome to send him on to Spain. And as he teaches the gospel, it will be through the obedience of faith. And that's going to be a critical part of that. I think the big issue in the New Testament is how do you make of the two one? How do you bring these two groups of people together? And there's a whole story about that I won't get to, but that's something that's very, very important. If you look at the next page, and again, I would do something different with your grandchildren. Did any of you have a grandmother that had a T-post clothesline? Ours were welded, and then we had these thick wires that ran through. And if you're playing tag at night, you want to be sure to know where the clothesline is, because if you get clotheslined, you're seriously hurt if you run into grandma's clothesline at night. Well, when I find the opening and the closing, in my mind, these are like the T-posts that are going to hold the letter together. And what did we find in the opening and the closing? He's going to stress this is the obedience that comes from faith. And then, either through word study or concordance, you get it out and check, oh, is obedience or obey used anywhere else in the letter? And you see what I put in the middle of the T-post? Look at how often at different times you have obeyed that form of doctrine which was delivered to you. And so running all through the book of Romans is going to be the concepts that were introduced on the T-post. Guess what the line is at the top? I want you to present your bodies as living sacrifices. And everything in the book of Romans, like you can put socks, you can put shirts, you can put underwear on the clothesline, everything in the book of Romans will be held up by the behavioral objective. Let me do another quick example that we all know. Sometimes, like for example, the petition, I urge you, in Romans, is between, I don't like the terms, but we still use them, the doctrinal section and the practical section. So often as Paul moves into a new section, he'll do that petition. But look at the one in 1 Corinthians. I urge you, 1 and 10. I urge you that you do what? That you all be united, that you speak the same things, and he goes through this, and that becomes the clothesline for the book of Corinthians, and you can hang every teaching and every doctrine that's in the book of 1 Corinthians on, I urge you to be united. As we go through the book of Romans, then we're going to hear, I urge you to present your bodies as living sacrifices. Jews, do not be conformed to your former way of thinking, meaning excluding Gentiles. And Gentiles, we need to exercise some grace. We need to allow our picky brethren to be who they are, but we need to love them anyway, and we need to not be shaped by either one of these present world's way of thinkings, but we are to have a metamorphosis and be transformed by the renewing of our mind and to bring the two together. I just want to close with one last thing, and obviously we'll come back and touch on some of this, Lord willing, next week. One of the amazing things about Paul is that as far as we can tell, we can account for 10,000 miles of travel. And Antioch has been jumping off point, and whether you're in Asia Minor or the Macedonian call to come into Europe, and he's always wanted to go to Rome. And one of the amazing things, and we've just introduced this again, there are 91 people listed by name in the New Testament, and 35 of them are in Romans 16. So here's a church that Paul hasn't been to, and he sends greetings to 31 people in a church that he hasn't visited yet. So in all these different places, he's been there. So what's going to happen in Romans is that he's going to address the Jew and the Gentile issue. He's going to explain, this is what I teach, this is who I am, this is the gospel. And then he's going to say, I want to come to you, preach the gospel, impart a spiritual gift, but I want you to send me to Spain. So in the same way that Philippians is a thank you letter for support that he's received, the book of Romans is a, Gary, how many letters have you sent out for support in your life? You know, here's a guy in hospital ministry, and you send a letter to a committee, you send a letter. And so we're going to deal with the Jew and the Gentile thing, call people together, call them to present their bodies as living sacrifices. I've been hindered, but I want to come to you, but I want you to send me to Spain. We're not told, did he ever get there? I wonder, did he ever get to Spain? I think those are driving things that are part of the book of Romans, and as we walk through this next quarter, then anticipate that. The obedience that comes from faith is going to be the T-post. Present your bodies as living sacrifice is going to be the heart of the main petition, and he wants to call these people together so, Lord willing, he can preach the gospel in a place where it's never been. God bless.